Chapter 1 is an introductory chapter. We don't get into a lot of biology, but we're going to discuss what biology is and how we study it. Essentially, we're going to go through the process of scientific thinking and the scientific method. At the beginning of each lecture session, you will be given a set of learning objectives. You don't have to write these down every time. Of course, you can if you want to, but those are available in Blackboard under your weekly course content and each individual chapter. You'll also find some study guides there. So those study guides are a bit more specific than these learning objectives. They have a list of vocabulary words and very directed and specific questions to help you learn the material. Now, those study guides are not updated every single semester, and every semester I might make little tiny changes. So if you come across something that you're just like, man, I don't even know what that is, one, check your notes and check your book and make sure that you didn't miss it. And then two, just come and check with me. If you're unsure if I left something out this semester, that's totally fine. I'm more than happy to answer your questions. So we are a biology course, so we should probably start off by defining what biology is. Most of you probably already know that biology is the scientific study of life. So biologists are asking questions about the living world. So they want to know how organisms grow, how they reproduce, how they interact with one another, how they survive. So how are they getting nutrients? How are they getting water? How are they getting shelter on a daily basis? How do those organisms change? How do they develop through their lifetime? How do they adapt to their environments? How do whole populations change? And then they are also interested in the processes that support these events. So they might look at chemicals in a body, or how proteins function, or what a particular organ is doing. Now, if we're going to talk about the living world, we also need to define what we mean by living. So the most basic definition is that a living organism is made up of one or more cells. Another way that you can say that is the cell is the smallest unit of life, meaning that the cell does all the things that it needs to do to sort of maintain in its environment. At the most basic level, it's going to grow, interact, and reproduce. Now, a living organism can be one cell big. Most of the organisms that you know about are multicellular, which means they're made up of a whole bunch of cells. But you may also be familiar with some different types of bacteria. Those are organisms that are made up of solely one cell. So on the right there, I have a diagram that shows just some different types of biology. We're only going to study a small subset. We are going to look at genetics and evolution. We'll do a little bit of ecology. We don't really have listed on here cell biology, but we're going to do a lot of cell biology and a lot of molecular biology. Now, all of these other areas may fall into different types of, or different places in these categories, but those are sort of the big topics that we are going to hit in our class. So why do we care? Why do we care about biology? Why do we care about learning how to do biology? Why do we care about the process of science? Well, we care about those things, science and biology, because by learning about them, science in general, or biology more specifically, or any area of science that you're interested in, helps us to understand and make wise decisions. So these might be decisions about your health, your diet, your interaction with others, the environment. By understanding how we do science, it can help you make decisions that are going to benefit you, your family, the things that are important to you, and society. So throughout this chapter, we're going to learn how to think scientifically, how to understand the scientific method. We're basically going to teach scientific literacy, which is understanding the process of science, how we measure things, what being empirical means, how understanding statistics can help us evaluate our data, and just generally having a basic understanding of scientific fields. Of course, we are going to focus on biology, but having a general understanding of how we do science lets you evaluate the scientific claims that you hear in the news, at school, wherever you might hear these things. It gives you a method for evaluating what you find to be true. So we are focusing mainly on only on biology. So we are most concerned with biological literacy. Biological literacy is using the process of scientific inquiry to think about real-world issues. So looking at real-world issues from an objective and scientific direction. We want to be able to communicate those issues to others, and we also want to integrate these real-world issues with a biological impact into your decision-making. So hopefully by the end of this lecture, as we've gone through this process of the scientific method, you will learn how scientists build their experiments, very broadly how they analyze their data, and how we know that we can trust the process of scientific inquiry or the scientific method to give us data that we can trust, so that you can evaluate claims about medicine, vaccines, your health, the environment, because you have an understanding of how they took place. So let's jump right into the scientific method. How do we use the scientific method? Well, you kind of do this all the time. Every time you make an observation, you wonder about something, no matter how big or how small, you're doing a little part of the scientific method. You're observing something that's interesting. You're attempting to explain why. You might do a little experiment. You know, maybe the light is off in your office or your bedroom right now, and you're thinking, man, I thought I turned that on. Why is it off? There's your observation. And you might think, oh, maybe the light bulb's dead. Then you do a little experiment. You walk over, you just try to flip the switch, and you discover, hey, the light bulb's not dead. I just forgot to turn it on. Or you discover, oh man, the light bulb is dead. You've done a little bit of the scientific method. So the scientific method, though, when we're talking about actually understanding the world around us, it's a little more structured. So we are going to start with making an observation. We might also think of this step as asking a question. They kind of go hand in hand. Sometimes you ask a question first, but usually something that you observe piques your interest. The next big broad step that we're going to do is make a hypothesis. We are going to propose a plausible explanation, not a guess, as to what is causing our problem or affecting our observation. We're going to make a prediction. So a prediction is just basically it's basically thinking about what data you would need to support your hypothesis. Then we're going to design an experiment that is going to produce the data that we hope will support our hypothesis. And then finally, we are going to make conclusions about this. Did you support your hypothesis? Did you explain what you were interested in explaining? Did it happen the way you thought it would? Those are sort of the big, broad steps of the scientific method. So we're going to go through each of them, some in greater detail than others because some of them need more detail than others. But we're going to learn how this important process gives us data based on actual observation. So scientific thinking is empirical. Now, this means that scientific discovery, scientific thinking is based on experience and observations that are rational, testable, and repeatable. So in other words, you are collecting data from a well-designed experiment that you can repeat, and that is based on a set of parameters that allows you to test exactly what you're trying to find. So empirical thinking basically means that you are actually finding a way to test and support your hypothesis. Sometimes you don't support your hypothesis, or let's say there's a clinical trial going on for a vaccine or a particular drug and the company is really excited about it. Sometimes they're going to get to a point where they're like, man, this is working great and we have all this data to back it up. And other times they're going to get to a point where they're like, oh man, this is not working. We've got all this data and it shows that this is no better than not doing anything, or this is no better than current treatments. So scientific thinking is also self-correcting. As you begin to study different areas, you can amass data, and that data is going to help you learn what's really going on. And sometimes the more data you get, the more you're going to realize, hey, my hypothesis was wrong. My hypothesis is not being supported here. And you can go back and you can evaluate what's going on. So a lot of what we do in science is constantly changing, constantly evolving. We're looking at new situations, new things happening in our world to see if the same sort of theories and rules and guidelines are still holding up. And if they're not, we fix it. So how do we actually do this process of empirical science? Let's talk about some things. All right, so step one, we're going to start by making observations or asking questions. So you do this when you note a particular pattern or a cause and effect, and you want to know why. Why is this pattern happening? Why is there a causal relationship between these two things? So this is all going to start with an observation. Now your book and your lab, which in some semesters you don't actually do lab 1, but in your book and in lab 1, it goes through this incredibly amazing explanation of this experiment where they were observing whether or not taking echinacea extract could reduce the likelihood of catching a common cold, or if it could reduce the duration of these symptoms. So you might be familiar with echinacea. It's a dietary supplement that is often promoted as something that'll keep you from getting a cold. My mom 100% believes in echinacea, and when I read her this section in the book, she was like, no, no, no. And then she started paying attention to taking echinacea and getting colds. And she had to evaluate whether or not she agreed with what this data in this section was telling us. So many people think that it reduces the likelihood of catching a common cold or the duration of symptoms. So someone decided, hey, we're going to actually study this. Is echinacea actually reducing the amount of times you catch a cold? Is it reducing how long you actually get a cold? So throughout this lecture, I'm not going to go through echinacea every single step. I would strongly encourage you to read in your book and your lab, even if we don't do that lab this semester, going through and actually reading it and taking notes on the specific sections related to echinacea. So essentially here, our observation is that echinacea reduces the duration of a cold. So we want to know, does echinacea actually reduce the symptoms of cold? So in order to do the scientific process, we need to ask a specific question. So here we're asking, does echinacea, I'm just going to abbreviate it, echinacea reduce the duration of the common cold? So there are different types of questions that we can ask when we are trying to solve a problem. Some scientific questions are causal, meaning we are asking for an explanation or a why. Some scientific questions are descriptive. They are trying to explain what you are observing in the sense that you're just gathering facts. Usually hypotheses are not going to answer descriptive questions. We happen to have a question here that is actually descriptive. Does echinacea reduce the duration of a common cold? A causal question for that might be, why does echinacea reduce the duration of a common cold? So there's a couple of other examples here. Causal, why do bald eagles hunt near cold water? A descriptive question might be, what is the range of a bald eagle, or where are they hunting? So very different types of questions. In general, we are looking for a causal question, and we are going to propose a hypothesis to answer that causal question. The next step is going to be formulating a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is not an educated guess. And what I mean by that is you should be forming a hypothesis based on everything you currently know about the topic. So you're not just randomly pulling an explanation out of the air. You are looking for a plausible, educated explanation. So a hypothesis is a proposed explanation for your observed phenomenon based on what you already know about your topic. Now, I guess there could be some situations where you actually know nothing. And at that point, you would go do some research to see what is already known and then formulate your plausible, educated explanation. So a hypothesis is going to establish alternative explanations. So there is not necessarily one answer to your question, and you have to be able to test it. It has to be testable. It must generate testable predictions. What I mean by that is that you must be able to design an experiment that gives you data that helps you determine whether or not you have supported your hypothesis. If you cannot design an experiment around it, you cannot consider it a valid hypothesis.